there, this is Bonnie Way from thekoalamom.com, and today I would like to tell you about one of the saints in my book, North American Martyrs Kids Activity Book. Saint Jean Saint Jean de Brebeuf is one of the well-known martyrs, or Canadian Martyrs or North American Martyrs, and he's also one of the first Jesuit missionaries to arrive in Canada. He got here around 1625 and spent a winter with the First Nations people learning their way of life before he was sent to join the Huron people. And there's kind of a funny story here in that Father Brebeuf was a big man. He was likely quite tall and quite broad-shouldered, and the Hurons were worried that he was going to break their canoes. They didn't want to let him into the canoes to take him on the many months, many weeks journey that it would take to get them to the mission. And he promised to sit very still in the canoe if they would let him go along. And they ended up nicknaming him Ishon, which means big man, I believe. And so they managed to make it safely to Huronia without breaking any canoes. And Father Jean de Brebeuf got to know the Hurons there, and he later wrote a dictionary, a Huron dictionary and a Huron grammar to help his fellow priests learn the language themselves, because he had to learn it just by speaking with the people, sitting around their fires, getting to know them, and trying to figure out what they were saying. And he passed on some advice to his fellow priests about, how to get to know the Huron people and how to become friends with them. And one of his advice was, do not begin to paddle unless you intend to always paddle. So I suspect there's a story behind that as well. Maybe he'd picked up a paddle just to see what he thought of it, and then they did. And then after Saint Jean de Brebeuf had been in New France for about 4 years, war between England and France forced him to return to France for a time. And so he went back to the Jesuit schools in France where he had taught. And while he was there, he likely met St. Isaac Jogues, who would later join him in the mission fields in New France. And in 1633, Father Jean de Brebeuf was able to return to Canada because the war between France and England had ended. Peace was ensured again, and so travel was permitted, and the French were allowed to go back to New France and to resume the mission work that they had started there. Saint Jean de Brebeuf went back and, went to find the friends that he had made last time. This time he chose a central location. Instead of living with the Huron in their villages, he chose a place to build a village and a mission that the people could come to. And he named this mission Saint Joseph. And it was from there that he reached out to the Hurons and tried to teach them the Catholic faith. And unfortunately, very few Hurons left behind their old ways to become Catholic. They just found the beliefs and ideas of the priests too new and too strange. And there was also the problem of smallpox, which was a new disease in North America, so many of the Hurons had no immunity to it as the priests did. This disease had unfortunately traveled across the oceans with the first European settlers who went to New France, and it devastated the Huron peoples. And because they knew that it had come with the white men, they often blamed the white men, and especially the priests, with their strange items for the smallpox. The Hurons were very superstitious people, and so many of the things that the priests regarded as holy, like their chalice and their rosary and the other items used in the Mass, the Hurons viewed these with suspicion and thought that they were magic objects. And so they often threatened to kill the missionaries. They tore down crosses and threw stones at the chapels. They threatened the missionaries' lives. And when Father Brebeuf tried to go to other tribes, the Huron went ahead of him, spreading lies about the missionaries. And so as missionaries, they were constantly fighting against, these lies and this fear and the rest of that they came into contact with these people. And so 7 years after working in the mission, Father Brebeuf went back to Quebec, and this was probably a little bit of a reprieve for him. He was able to work, kind of in the churches with the settlers, and he organized the supply trains to the missions in Huronia, and just kind of acted as a regular priest there instead of a missionary with his life under threat. But in 1644, Father Brebeuf returned to the Hurons, and one can really picture that this is where his heart is, because he's come and gone so many times. He went to the Hurons, and then he had to leave to go to France because of the war, and then he went to the Hurons again, and then he went back to Quebec to take a break, and then he returned to the Hurons. And you can just picture this big man who, learned their language and wrote this dictionary and this grammar, and, just constantly tried to reach out to them despite their fear and despite their lies and what they said about him, just, always reaching out to them and trying to love them and trying to teach them. And I have great respect for these men who kept on in an environment like this. Like, I can only imagine St. Jean de Brebeuf could have stayed in France. He could have kept teaching at the universities when, after he'd spent 4 years here, he could have said, oh, I did the missionary thing and now I'm going to teach and send other missionaries there. But he came back here and spent time among the people, even though it was so hard and such disappointing work. I guess it wasn't what they had expected. And this was where he was in 1649 when the Iroquois began to attack and to kill the Hurons. And the priests were, kind of kept caught in the middle of the hatred that the Iroquois bore for the Hurons. And so the Hurons had been fleeing to the missions. Many of them were refugees because of the Iroquois attacks. And many of them had gathered around the priests looking for, help and support. And this was where Father Jean de Brebeuf was with his friend Gabriel Lallement, and they were taken captive in 1649 and tortured by the Iroquois and killed. And the story is told that St. Jean de Brebeuf was tortured for many hours, and yet he withstood the tortures of the Iroquois with such courage, such quiet courage and bravery, that after he was dead, they actually cut out his heart and ate it as just a sign of respect for him and for his courage. In another place, he said, "May I die only for you, if you will grant me this grace, since you willingly died for me." And the martyrs all knew that it was likely that their work would end in their deaths. They knew other priests had been killed during this time, and so they knew that their lives were on the line, and they were willing to give their lives. They were willing to have to face the tortures of the Iroquois and to be killed for the love of God, because they knew that God had loved them and had died for them. And so I hope this inspires you, and I hope that you'll check out my kids' activity book if St. Jean de Brebeuf interests you and you think your kids would like to learn more about him. Have a great day.